Everyone thinks Canada built the Trans Mountain Pipeline to pump more oil. But the truth is far bigger. This $25 billion project was Canada's escape plan from America's economic grip. For decades, nearly every Canadian barrel flowed south into US pipelines. Americans set the price. Americans took the profits. Canadians were left with whatever trickled back. One leader who saw this clearly was Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. In 1973, as oil prices soared and Middle Eastern wars choked supply, he read reports that terrified him. Canada had the world's third largest reserves, but almost no control. To him, it looked like colonialism in a new disguise, and he was determined to break free. But geography had other plans. To the west, the Rockies. To the north, the Arctic. To the south, America's dominance. Canada was boxed in. It would take 50 years, billions of dollars, and the most ambitious pipeline project in the nation's history to break that trap. And in 2024, the escape finally came online. A lifeline stretching from Alberta to the Pacific. This is the story of how Canada built its way out of America's shadow, and why this single pipeline may be the smartest bet the country has ever made. To understand why Canada needed to escape, you need to see the geographic reality of North American energy. Canada sits on the world's third largest oil reserves, 170 billion barrels in Alberta's oil sands alone. But geography had made Canada a prisoner of American infrastructure. In 2010, 99% of Canadian oil exports flowed south through a network of pipelines built in the 1950s and 60s. These pipelines carried Canadian crude to American refineries in Texas, Louisiana, and the Midwest, where it was processed and sold at American-controlled prices. American refineries in the Gulf Coast were specifically designed to process heavy Canadian crude. This created a geographic monopoly. Canadian oil producers had no choice but to sell to American buyers, often at steep discounts to world prices. The numbers were staggering. Canadian oil regularly sold for $10 to $20 per barrel less than world prices because producers had no alternative buyers. This Canadian discount cost the country's economy $15 to $20 billion annually in lost revenue. Geography had created this problem. The Rocky Mountains formed a natural barrier between Alberta's oil sands and Pacific ports. Building pipelines through this mountainous terrain was expensive and technically challenging, so early developers chose the easier route south to existing American infrastructure. By 2010, existing pipelines were operating at full capacity. Canadian oil production was growing rapidly, but pipeline capacity wasn't. This created bottlenecks that further depressed Canadian oil prices and increased dependence on American infrastructure. Meanwhile, Asian economies were experiencing explosive growth. China's oil imports had increased. Japan, South Korea, and India were all seeking reliable oil suppliers. But Canadian oil couldn't reach these markets due to geographic constraints. And that's when America's grip tightened. The breaking point came with the Keystone XL pipeline saga. This proposed pipeline would have carried Canadian oil to American refineries, but it became a political football in Washington. For over a decade, American politicians used Keystone XL approval as leverage over Canadian policy. American environmental groups successfully blocked multiple Canadian pipeline projects, not just Keystone XL. The Northern Gateway pipeline to British Columbia's coast was canceled after intense US-funded opposition campaigns. American refineries were making enormous profits from cheap Canadian oil. Gulf Coast refineries earned $15 to $25 per barrel processing Canadian crude, profits that should have stayed in Canada if the country had its own refining capacity and export infrastructure. The US treated Canadian oil as part of their strategic energy security, but offered no guarantees about continued access to American infrastructure. Canadian officials realized that in a crisis, American energy needs would come first. Even trade deals tilted south. Under NAFTA, Canada had to keep supplying oil to the US, even in a shortage. But nothing guaranteed Canada fair treatment in return. American companies were acquiring Canadian oil producers at bargain prices, taking advantage of the geographic discount. ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, and other US giants were buying Canadian assets for 30 to 40% below their potential value. Pipeline bottlenecks were costing Canada's economy $15 to $20 billion annually in lost GDP. Alberta's provincial government calculated that every dollar of oil price discount cost the province $200 million in royalty revenue. Projects were stalled, billions were lost, and Washington kept the upper hand. But hidden in the background was a small pipeline already pointing west. Too small to matter unless someone dared to expand it. The solution already existed, but it was too small. The original Trans Mountain Pipeline, built in 1953, carried oil 1,150 kilometers from Edmonton to Vancouver. But its capacity was just 300,000 barrels per day, a fraction of what Canada needed. The Trans Mountain expansion would triple capacity to 890,000 barrels per day by building a parallel pipeline along the same route. This would require crossing the Rocky Mountains, the Fraser River Valley, and some of Canada's most challenging terrain. The route wasn't just long, it was brutal. Engineers had to cross 1,400 rivers, tunnel under cities, and build through avalanche zones where snow can fall faster than concrete can set. The most complex section runs through Burnaby Mountain, requiring a 2.6-kilometer tunnel through solid rock beneath a densely populated urban area. This tunnel alone cost millions of dollars and took 3 years to complete. The pipeline terminates at the Westridge Marine Terminal in Burnaby, which required massive expansion to handle Aframax tankers carrying 750,000 barrels each. The terminal expansion included new loading berths, storage tanks, and safety systems. From Vancouver, Canadian oil can reach Asian refineries in 14 to 16 days compared to 24 to 30 days via the Panama Canal from Gulf Coast ports. This geographic advantage would make Canadian oil more competitive in rapidly growing Asian markets. Access to Asian markets could eliminate the Canadian oil discount entirely, potentially adding $15 to $20 billion annually to Canada's economy. Asian refineries were willing to pay world prices for reliable Canadian crude supplies. It sounded like the perfect solution. But turning that vision into reality would require a gamble bigger than anything Canada had ever attempted. What started as a $5.4 billion private project in 2013 became a $25 billion government undertaking by 2024. Cost overruns were driven by regulatory delays, environmental challenges, and the complexity of building through mountainous terrain. In 2018, facing regulatory uncertainty and cost overruns, Kinder Morgan threatened to cancel the project. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made a shocking decision. The Canadian government would buy the pipeline for $4.5 billion and complete construction itself. Construction required different techniques for each geographic zone: tunnel boring through mountains, horizontal directional drilling under rivers, and specialized welding for extreme temperature variations. Over 17,000 workers were employed at peak construction. Then came the toughest conversations of all, with 129 Indigenous communities whose lands the pipeline would cross. Routes had to be redrawn, sacred sites avoided. Every agreement added time, cost, and complexity. But without their voices, the project would have died on paper. Environmental protection measures added billions in extra costs, but were essential for approval. These included wildlife corridors, salmon habitat restoration, marine mammal protection systems, and world-class spill response capabilities. The project required approvals from federal, provincial, and municipal governments, plus regulatory bodies overseeing energy, environment, transportation, and indigenous affairs. The approval process took over a decade and cost hundreds of millions in regulatory fees alone. After years of battles in boardrooms, courtrooms, and construction sites, the pipeline was finally complete. But the real question was simple: would it work? On May 1st, 2024, Canada finally flipped the switch. The Trans Mountain expansion came online, and a few weeks later, the first tanker pushed off from the Westridge terminal in Vancouver. Its name was the Dubai Angel, loaded with about 550,000 barrels of Alberta crude. Its destination wasn't Texas or Louisiana, it was Asia. For the first time, Canadian oil was sailing straight across the Pacific, bypassing American infrastructure entirely. That moment marked more than just a shipment. It was a turning point. For years, Canadian crude had sold at a painful discount because producers had no way to reach other buyers. Now, with access to world markets, that Canadian discount began to shrink, and producers finally had the leverage to demand better prices. Asian refineries in China, Japan, South Korea, and India started taking Canadian cargoes, eager for a reliable new supplier. For Canada, those deals meant more than profits. They meant independence, no longer captive to a single market. And the ripple effects stretched far beyond Alberta's oil sands. Higher revenues flowed into provincial and federal coffers. Engineers, steelmakers, and shipping firms across the country felt the impact of reduced dependence on American refineries. But one thing Canada didn't do was copy the United States' massive strategic petroleum reserve. Instead, it leaned on commercial storage hubs and international agreements to manage supply shocks. As for American refiners, especially on the West Coast, the hit wasn't dramatic, at least not right away. Gulf Coast margins stayed strong, though the loss of ultra-cheap Canadian crude added pressure as global supplies tightened. That first voyage wasn't just the end of a project, it was the beginning of a transformation. Trans Mountain didn't just add another pipeline, it redrew Canada's energy map. For decades, almost every barrel of Canadian oil headed south into the United States. But with the new expansion, a steady stream now flows west across the Pacific. By 2025, China had already emerged as the top overseas buyer. The US still takes the lion's share of Canadian crude, but for the first time in living memory, Canada isn't locked into a one-way relationship. That shift matters. Pacific access means Canadian producers can now court Asian markets, Japan, South Korea, India, not just Texas and Louisiana. It gives Canada bargaining power it never had before. In 2010, virtually 99% of Canadian oil exports went south. By 2024, the figure was closer to 94%. That might not sound like much, but in a business where billions ride on small price differences, it's a seismic change. And Trans Mountain isn't the end of the story. Other projects, like the Coastal GasLink line feeding LNG Canada on the Pacific coast, are opening new paths for Canadian natural gas. Piece by piece, Canada is reducing its dependence on American energy infrastructure. The payoff is already clear. Canadian oil that once sold at steep discounts now has a chance to reach world markets at world prices. That means more revenue for producers, more royalties for governments, and more economic independence for the country as a whole. It's the kind of independence Pierre Trudeau dreamed about back in the 1970s, when he warned that Canada must never be a resource colony of its southern neighbor. 50 years and $25 billion later, that vision is finally real. This pipeline doesn't just carry oil, it carries sovereignty, bargaining power, and the freedom to set Canada's own course in global energy. Canada's $25 billion gamble shows that sometimes the biggest risks create the biggest freedoms. But here's the question: Was this truly the moment Canada escaped America's shadow? Or just the start of a new kind of dependence, this time on Asia? If you want to see how geography keeps shaping the fate of nations, don't forget to like this video and hit subscribe. We've got plenty more fascinating geography stories coming your way.